Hey everyone, I'm still on the road. I've been traveling quite a bit, but I wanted to get this video out because there's a lot going on. Especially want to give you a bit of feedback on what I think is happening with the new administration in terms of its impact on LNG. We'll talk about that. I was in Europe for the last few weeks, talked to a few different people, and the situation in Europe is quite volatile in terms of energy. I think there's definitely a realization in Europe that LNG is really going to be the primary form of imported energy. There is a realization that the customers, the public, is just not willing to pay for expensive energy like the governments have been trying to push. There's a realization that project costs are getting much higher than everybody expected, especially offshore wind and other things like that. And there's a realization that some of these green policies that are being promoted by some of the governments, especially in Germany and the UK, etc., are actually not that politically very attractive to people. And the governments are definitely in jeopardy. And I think they're now changing their tune a little bit. I was in Central and Eastern Europe in a few different countries, and definitely, even these countries, which are quite far from an LNG import terminal, are looking at their import terminal options. They're realizing that without an import terminal, they'll have to make deals with neighboring countries, but the deals are being made. They are looking at importing and building new terminals in places like Greece, in Croatia, even up in the north, in the Baltics, to bring gas down to those Eastern and Central European countries. I was surprised they weren't freaking out as much about the turn off by Russian gas. I think that was kind of expected. And I think people are learning to deal with it. But definitely the LNG importers are stepping up, and they're going to be, making up that gas supply. There is a bit of talk about what happens now that Trump's in power and the war gets over in the Ukraine. Does that mean that we'll be buying Russian gas again in Europe? I think there's a trepidation to commit too much to Russian gas. I know that Russian LNG continues unabated, but Russian pipeline gas, I think, is going to be a bit of a harder struggle to convince the Europeans that they should count on it because they've just spent so much money and time and expense over the last few years dealing with the Russian gas monopoly. So I think that Russian gas will have a hard time establishing itself unless, of course, the price is amazing and they can't refuse. But Russian LNG, I have a feeling that that is going to be the way Russian gas kind of re-enters the market again. I was actually quite surprised to see that there is this realization that even though we have paid a lot of money for LNG over the last few years, that they will continue having to pay the money, and they're willing to pay the higher cost for LNG if that's what it takes. I think there's a government support to make sure that energy security is there. There's a government supports to make sure that all the storage is kept full, and the government is now realizing that things like hydrogen, etc., that they thought are going to make an impact on the gas supply of these countries, it's really not going to work. Speaking of hydrogen, I spent some time with some hydrogen technology folks. I learned quite a bit. I think I'm more convinced that the production of hydrogen is getting more and more efficient. It's all about scale. Once you get into a larger scale, you can produce more, but it really depends on having a lot of energy. But the production of energy, hydrogen, such as electrolyzers and all that technology, is advancing. I think that where the hydrogen is going to stumble, and I don't see any quick, easy solution, is the transportation and storage of hydrogen. That is really going to be the key. I talked to somebody who's very well conversant on hydrogen in pipes, hydrogen in normal storage tanks, and it's not that easy. You have to modify everything. The hydrogen makes the metal brittle, especially any of the welds. So any pipe that has to carry hydrogen has to be seamless, and seamless pipes, this is pure hydrogen, of course, and seamless pipes can only be of a certain size and they cost a lot more. And so that is all these constraints that are going to have a real problem in making hydrogen a realistic transportation fuel. Transportation. So I think where hydrogen will grow, maybe around the world, again, very, very small amounts, but where it will grow is what we call inside the battery limits, inside a refinery or inside an industrial zone or inside a group of refineries or petrochemical plants. The hub around Rotterdam makes a bit of sense. The hub around Houston makes a bit of sense. But are we going to see hydrogen superhighways crossing the continent in Europe? Absolutely not. It's just not going to happen anytime soon. So gas is going to be the key, and LNG then becomes the default case. There is a worry that LNG is going to get more political under the new US administration. I'll come back to that. There is no, I think it will. I think they have to accept it. But LNG is kind of, all energy is political in the end of the day. I mean, the Russian gas to Europe has been political, if nothing else. Let's talk about some of the other projects that I heard some stuff about. There seems to be a consensus that Mozambique is really struggling. That's onshore. There's a consensus that Coral is doing very well, the offshore project. So I think that's quite good for Mozambique. But any of these big onshore projects are really going to get over the security risk, the finance risk. Just, I don't think there's much left from the Total project that they started building many years ago. I'm sure it's all pretty much messed up or destroyed. So I think any estimates of it starting production in 2029, etc., are wildly optimistic. I just don't see it happening. Um, Indonesia, we have seen some news recently that Indonesia is going to require more and more LNG for domestic usage. I think that projects that are looking at exporting from Indonesia, the current ones as well as the future ones, are going to really have to consider themselves that there'll be a larger domestic market obligation. So any of these new projects coming in Indonesia, they really should not be looked at as adding to global energy supply, because that is going to be used within Indonesia itself. Abadi, Tangguh, Phase 3, etc., etc. So I think that really puts out Asia as being a growth. I don't think there's going to be much growth in Asia at all. Australia is going to bear, all its new projects are barely going to keep flat the current production, if that. I think that the Middle East projects are two, the one in Abu Dhabi and the expansion in Qatar are doing very, very well. They seems to be on target. So I think that will bring new supply to the market. At what cost? There was a definite discussion that Qatari LNG comes at much tighter terms and maybe potentially a higher cost, but it is a stable source of supply, and you accept the fact that it is political in whatever way it is. Abu Dhabi, I think it remains to be seen whether they'll be in the Qatari camp or more in the commercial camp, but I think their projects are going ahead quite well. I think I'm quite impressed with the way Abu Dhabi is executing on all these different oil and gas projects, actually. Other projects, I think in Africa, some of the smaller ones are kind of moving along. We're finally going to see some production coming out of Mauritania, things like that. But these are all relatively small. And the African continent is going to grow and grow in demand. And I think a lot of the gas will ultimately stay there. So that's what we're going to see. Um, so, really, we're back to the US and North America. I think LNG Canada will be doing an expansion. I think that's pretty exciting. I don't know about what else in Canada is going to happen. I know that because of the recent Trump stuff, that they want to look at restarting, rethinking about exporting out of the East. I think kind of Canada is just a difficult place to do that. Interesting news about Mexico Pacific moving to Houston. I've also heard they're being sold to a Mexican company. I don't know. I think that's a setback in my view. People are going to be as comfortable buying from a Mexican company that may be under a bit more government control. I know that the Mexican government is going to have more issues with the American government. There's going to be a bit more tariffs. I don't think that NAFTA is going to be the way it used to be. And it remains to be seen whether there'll be a tariff on American gas crossing into Mexico. If so, that's going to be a different problem for Mexican LNG export projects. And there may be a political angle. How happy is the DOE going to be for American gas to be exported from a different country? Would it still get the same breaks and the same permits to do so? I think that adds a risk, especially when the company is now no longer owned by an American, but owned by a Mexican company. So I think Mexico Pacific, I think it's a setback, but we'll see what happens. And I think the US projects, well, it remains to be seen which ones get to FID this year. I think Commonwealth is looking at FID. Maybe Texas towards the end of the year might get to FID. I think there's a lot of hype around Alaska. I don't think much is going to happen, honestly. I think there's a bit of lip service because Trump is pushing the Japanese to talk about Alaska. I think we all really know that Alaska is a very difficult project. It's going to cost a lot of money, and there's better sources of supply everywhere else, and to build in Alaska is going to be very difficult labor wise. So let's now kind of talk about what's happening in the first couple of weeks of the Trump administration in terms of LNG. There's obviously a lot of stuff happening in the political arena. That's not what I'm going to comment on. Um, On the positive side, we've seen a new Secretary of Energy announced. He's talked about restarting the LNG, getting rid of the ban, but it's going to be in a measured way. I think Putin and some of the other consultants had warned that. So it'll take a few months to kind of go through the system. There'll be a queue and there'll be the normal review process, but it will not, the ban will be lifted. The ban of reviewing LNG export permits will be lifted. It remains to be seen their stance on renewals of companies that have expired. Trump obviously is a big fan of LNG and big fan of oil and gas. The drill baby drill mantra is going to increase production in the US, going to make it easier to produce. I expect gas prices in that way, gas production to go up. Gas prices might go down. It all depends if AI and things like that really are living up to the hype in terms of data centers. If they don't, I think it's really great for the LNG industry. We'll have more production, lower gas prices. And I think that's why we see American gas producers looking at exporting via the LNG format, and not just accepting the Henry Hub price. If I was an American gas producer of size, why would I just want to accept the local gas price when I can see that the international price is almost always higher, even with all the margins of production and shipping, etc. Why don't you capture that margin and you'll be right 90% of the time? In the past there was a bit of reluctance, or my the shareholders won't accept it, or the royalty owners won't accept it, or the bankers won't accept it. I think those days are over. People see America's role in LNG, and I think gas producers are going to start taking more of an ownership interest or an equity interest or even a tolling interest in US LNG export projects. um, I think that will be interesting to see how the pressure on FERC to be more efficient. Obviously, if I was a government employee at FERC, I'll be wanting to show that I am one of the more efficient ones. I think projects that are in the FERC system, such as Gulfstream, might be the beneficiaries of that. Let's see what happens. But either way, I think we'll have an interesting working relationship with the government. We look forward to working them in a constructive and very efficient manner. Um, Trump is pressuring all the allies and even the non-allies to buy more LNG. I think every one of the leaders that are going to meet Trump in the next few months are going to say they're going to promise to buy more American energy, and that really means more LNG. So I think American LNG is definitely going to be very much in favor around the world, and I think that that'll help projects, secure contracts, because there'll be a political will from those countries to buy more American gas to avoid tariffs, etc. Now, speaking of tariffs, if tariffs do get installed, the retaliatory tariffs are a bit of a worry. We've seen China already impose that. I don't see it makes much of a difference in the long term existing contracts because those prices are already pretty low. But I think it will make a difference on spot trade, because the spot trade is basically the price of the cargo. And if it's beat other people's spot price, and American gas importing to China will cost 15% more. So the spot price, spot trade of American gas might be impacted if there's more retaliatory tariffs around the world. But long term, American gas is still a damn good deal, and I don't see anybody backing away from that. Even with the 15 or 20% tariff, American gas is usually cheaper than other places. Of course, as I said before, American gas may get more political. That may be a backlash against that. There may be countries that look, and companies that don't want to be too overly exposed. So yeah, I think it's interesting to see what's going to be the total impact on the Trump policies. We're definitely going to see the FERC process improve. I am a bit concerned about the rising cost of labor. Obviously, the simple deportation and things like that happening. I don't think they have a direct impact on LNG construction projects in the US, but there might be a knock-on effect if all labor starts costing more because we have less ability to bring in labor at the bottom end. It might impact the higher end, and I think that's something that we should be watching over the next few years as well. So overall, though, I think that the Trump policies, though, might seem a bit chaotic in terms of LNG and energy, U.S. energy. I think they're positive. Uh, I hope the retaliatory terrorists are limited, and I hope that cool minds prevail and we get on with the show. So thank you very much for that. Appreciate your time.